Hi, everyone. Welcome back to FTF Coffee Breaks. This is gearing up for the COVID crime wave, take two. If you joined us last week and we had any issues with technology, we thank you for coming back today. I am Maureen Lowe. I'm the founder and president of FTF. I'm also one of your co-hosts for today's episode, along with my favorite chief content officer, Eugene Grigo. I'm also joined by our special guests, Neil Katkov of Celent, Les Joseph of Wells Fargo, and Maria LaConte of Deutsche Bank. As I mentioned, this is our FTF Coffee Breaks. We're focusing on all things financial crime as it relates to COVID-19 today. We will be covering how firms are coping with the current pandemic with financial crime. We'll be discussing any new fraud that might have emerged, how teams are working together to be proactive, and some of the security issues around remote working. We'll also be discussing some of the technologies that are available to fight the various forms of crime, among other things. So we have lots of great content for you today. We are live streaming and we are all joining us from our home offices. So if we have any glitches here or there, please be patient with us. We will catch up. As you can see, we have a chat feature enabled today. We do encourage you to interact with us. If you have a comment about anything that we're talking about, or if you have a question that you would like to ask our panel, the only thing that we ask is to please be kind to one another. We are looking to build a positive interaction with each other. If you do see a question that's submitted by one of your peers and you also like it, please give it a thumbs up. That will help me manage the questions that we are receiving. I'm the one who's going to be managing questions more so behind the scenes, and Eugene will be running the main conversation. So with that, I think we're ready to get started. Maybe we can go around to each of our speakers and you can just introduce yourselves and then we'll kick off with our panel. Thank you.
If I may start, my name is Neil Katkov. I head the risk and compliance practice at Celent. We cover operational risk and financial risk in this practice. A large focus for us is anti-money laundering. We've been covering that since 2002. Celent is an international research and advisory firm that provides information about financial services technology.
Thank you, Neil. Les?
Thanks, Maureen. Good morning, everyone. My name is Les Joseph. I'm the manager of the Global Financial Crimes Intelligence Group at Wells Fargo. I manage a team of bright and very creative intelligence analysts, and we try to keep our senior management and lines of business up to date with what's happening in financial crimes. Prior to joining Wells Fargo in 2010, I spent 25 years at the U.S. Department of Justice as a criminal prosecutor. Most of that time I was in the money laundering and asset forfeiture and money laundering section. And from about 2000 to 2010, we initiated a series of enforcement actions against financial institutions that were not fulfilling their obligations under the Bank Secrecy Act and anti-money laundering laws. So it's great to be here. Thank you, Maureen.
Thanks, Les. Maura?
Yeah, hi, I'm Maura LaConte. First of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this session with my esteemed panel. I am currently the Deputy Head of Financial Crimes Operations at Deutsche Bank, manage the investigations and the reporting of suspicious activity reports, as well as the MI and Special Investigations team. I also have over 15 years of anti-financial crimes experience and, look very excited to participate today.
Okay. So I'll just provide a quick overview and then we'll dive into the questions. But the pandemic lockdown is straining the resources of financial services firms in lots of new ways. And there have been many efforts to fight financial crime and money laundering, but I think with the pandemic, it has increased the opportunity for the criminals to take aim. And yeah, as the staff of most financial services firms are working from home, the criminals are targeting remote connections or cyber attacks, creating new opportunities for money laundering, and there's always the threat of terrorist financing. And just quickly to recap what Maureen had said, we're going to talk about, perhaps some ways to provide protections for web teleconferencing, maybe some more firm-based IT systems and networking protections, IT and data strategies to prevent sophisticated money laundering and terrorist financing, and ways to improve staff awareness of these financial crime threats. So, to kick things off, to the panel, what are the major financial crime scenarios, including fraud, that are occurring during the pandemic lockdown?
Thanks, Eugene. I'll start out on that one. And as you said, the criminals have been very quick to jump on the COVID bandwagon. In some ways, the pandemic has spawned an epidemic of crime and fraud along the way. But during this period, we're not really seeing new types of fraud. We're just seeing the criminals quickly adapt new scenarios that are COVID related to try, and prey upon people when they're vulnerable and heightened sense of anxiety. So there's really almost every kind of fraud involved. FinCEN, which is part of the Treasury Department, issued an advisory in March of 2020, and they noted some of the emerging trends that included imposter scams. So these are cases where the criminals might, for example, pretend to be from a charity to help people that are, affected by COVID, or company that's selling, equipment or supplies for COVID that they don't really have. We're seeing investment scams where people are promoting that they have products, or you might have a company that's saying they've developed a new cure or treatment for COVID when they really haven't, trying to get people to invest in their business. We're seeing product scams where people are simply selling companies that are misbranded or not approved for treatment. And we're seeing some insider trading too that's related to COVID. Just a couple of other ones, business email compromise has been a plague for the last several years now, where people spoof emails and making it look like they're from someone else, and usually soliciting payments. So again, we're seeing this occur in relation to maybe payment. Again, people are working remotely. Things are not always operating in the regular ways. So people aren't as aware as they might be in these kinds of schemes. There was one case cited by the FBI where a financial institution received an email allegedly from the CEO of a company who had previously scheduled a transfer of $1 million, and the email requested that the transfer be moved up and the recipient account be changed due to the coronavirus outbreak. And in fact, that email was a fraud and changed the destination of the wire fraud so that it went to the criminals instead of where it was supposed to go. We've seen, for some reason, unemployment fraud schemes, especially in the state of Washington. They've had a huge string of people fraudulently applying for unemployment claims, and this appears to be part of some large network that's engaged in this. And then finally, the PPP loans, Paycheck Protection Program, where businesses have been allowed to apply for loans. There have been a lot of fraudulent applications where people are trying to take advantage of the situation in order to get PPP loans that they're not entitled to. So the schemes really run the gamut of everything right now.
Yeah, unless if I could add on to that,
Sure.
Financial institutions have definitely had to react a lot quicker than they're used to. As you mentioned, the fraudsters are, definitely, quicker. So, in some cases whereby, you had scenarios around bank tellers and those types of things. Now you've had to change that because banks have had to close down that kind of mechanism for people to use as far as, cash and those types of things. So you've had to kind of think about different scenarios around, okay, how else are they going to be moving the money around Also dormant accounts, as far as accounts that were, originally dormant, you want to start keeping track as far as if there's any fluctuation, because there could have been either a account takeover or something, structuring as well, because now again, you have all those different kinds of mechanisms to move the cash around, and also be cognizant of your behavioral type of scenarios. As you mentioned, FinCEN did put out these particular types of advisories, and financial institutions should definitely take those types of advisories and create awareness and training around those with the teams, as far as what to look for, even just personally, and let alone from an investigative perspective and an institutional perspective. Workshops, should be coordinated, and you want to keep the teams as with the transparency of the information and up to date as possible. And I think it's just wonderful how the regulators have been keeping that information, at our fingertips, and we haven't seen that previously. So those are some of the things that I think financial institutions should be thinking of. Neil, I don't know, do you have anything you want to add, or?
Yeah, I think also we should add our favorite government agency, the IRS, to that. They've also put out guidance, because there are IRS scams around supplemental paychecks. I think one of the really interesting things about the scenarios that you, Maura, and Les are talking about is that, as Les said, they really do run the gamut from traditional account takeover, phishing scams, social engineering scams, to sophisticated fraud operations around, fraudulent applications, period. That really is running the entire gamut from what one might call more technological attacks to well-planned schemes. And I think that's a challenge for any bank because of that very broad range there.
And very quickly, do cryptocurrencies, any scenarios around there, is fraud on the rise with them, with cryptocurrencies, Bitcoins, and so forth at the center of it? Has that been a factor?
I don't think it's been a factor any more than it is in before the crisis. It's people. There have been all kinds of scams with cryptocurrency. Again, with trading scams, and in a lot of cases, perpetrators of fraud ask to receive their money in Bitcoin so that they think it's harder to trace. But I haven't seen any increase in connection with the pandemic.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
agree.
How are financial services firms coping with this rise in financial crime as the pandemic crisis continues?
Well, I'll take that. I mean, as far as the COVID is concerned, look, all of our lives have changed, from a, professional perspective. Institutions were very wary of, allowing workers to work remotely. And now we were placed in a position where you had to work remotely. So they had to quickly come up with, things as far as technology is concerned, as far as production, as far as, capacity, those types of things. But the reality is, we cope better than they thought we would. I think there's about 80% of the workforce now working remotely, if not more. We also have challenges with, children working from home, children, online learning, those types of things as well. But I think it worked well. And we are hearing that it is working well from the various institutions. And they're actually considering now, to be able to think about working remotely once, as the pandemic is, slowly and we're going into different phases and being, allowed to, be brought back to normalcy. But as far as, different things, as far as coping is concerned, it's more around your governance and your controls and effectiveness, and transparency with the regulators and communicating with them on any types of, issues that you may be having, as it's coming up. I think that's important. And then reevaluating your scenarios and your thresholds and being very quick to being able to, put the changes in place. And then, what types of management information are you bringing in around production, and are you being productive, and are you, filing your SARs on time, and are you going through your investigation operations within the proper time periods? And the reality is, the answer is yes, that most institutions have been, and they've been very successful about it. I think it's a great news story for financial institutions. And, as from the previous question, we've also been able to, detect different instances of fraud that, the bad guys are perpetrating. So, but I'll turn it over to either Les or Neil to add to it.
Yeah, for Wells Fargo, it's it's pretty much the same. I mean, we've fortunately made a seamless transition from working in the office to working remotely, and that's worked well. All of our investigators, everyone's working from home, and that's worked out pretty well despite the distractions and some of the difficulties. Probably the biggest issue is this. You see fraud patterns shift over time, but to see something shift so quickly as it has in this to different fraud scenarios has been a challenge, because we're already working at pretty full capacity. So when you start seeing some of these things like unemployment fraud schemes that develop very quickly, or the PPP fraud, which is a completely new area, though that it just takes additional resources, or you have to put resources on there right away, so it becomes kind of a balancing of what you're doing. You can't stop doing what you're doing, but you have some additional areas too. So it's always a challenge. But again, we've been pretty quick to adapt to the changing trends and activity we're seeing.
Neil, just any thoughts on that?
I think one thing that's very interesting is that there is at the same time an uptick in online payments, of course, for all the the e-commerce deliveries that are happening, and as replacing in-person retail. And so models or scenarios, fraud detection scenarios, will have to account for that. And I suppose traditionally they do. They account for spikes during the Christmas season and things like that. But I think that also might pose a challenge, because some of these things presumably have to be rewritten, at least the parameters and thresholds, to try to account for normal activity, which is also very unusual at this time. And I think that might pose a challenge. You and I, Les, were talking on the pre-call about the challenges of changing models or scenarios from the regulatory perspective. And so there's a process challenge as well in banks responding to changing behaviors, and then justifying that to the regulators, I suppose.
Yeah, it's, as you said, Neil, there's changes in activity as a result of the, changed financial situation. And, large banks, as and all banks run some scenarios to try and identify unusual activity. A large bank like Wells Fargo runs many scenarios to try and identify unusual activity. And it's, obviously it's you don't want to change these too quickly, because the regulators are looking for continuity over time. So they don't want you to be adjusting, your scenarios to adopt to certain circumstances. Certainly, for example, banks have gotten into trouble when they find they're getting too many alerts. So they change the parameters for their alerting so that they get fewer alerts. Obviously, that's not something you want to do, because that means you're not going to identify all of the unusual and potentially suspicious activity. So it can be difficult to change the parameters very quickly. And there's this concept of model validation for financial institutions that mean many of the patterns or scenarios that they run are considered models that are validated by very smart mathematicians and people working at the bank. And every time you want to change a scenario, pretty much it's got to be validated, which means you can't just change things on the fly, even though the activity is changing very quickly. So that can be a challenge. That doesn't mean you can't do other things to try and identify the unusual activity, but to change the alerting parameters up or down to identify new trends very quickly can be a challenge for financial institutions.
Maureen, do you have a question from the audience?
So actually, I think we wanted to reach out and see if we can get the audience to interact with us a bit. We have a question that we were hoping that you might answer, and let us know how your firm is responding to the greater number of financial crime incidents taking place during the pandemic. Are you upgrading your IT infrastructures? Are you reaching out to regulators proactively? Are you creating new channels for communication? Are you making staff adjustments, whether you're hiring or laying off? We'd love to know if you just want to enter into the chat what your firm has been doing, and then we'll come back later and have our panels comment on that. We have had one question come in from the audience in the meantime. They're wondering, has there been any area that has been very difficult to control fraud due to COVID?
It's as I said, it's the newer scenarios that we're not used to seeing that are more of a challenge. I mean, business email compromise, for example, we've been working on for several years, and that's regular part of our program. When you have a program like the PPP fraud, which is something completely new, where all of a sudden people are applying for these loans and very quickly, and the government is wanting you to process these loans very quickly. And of course, we want to process them very quickly too to help out the businesses. That's a completely new area that's out of our usual routine activity. So that's an area that you have to address quickly. And it's just we're not in a mode where we can all of a sudden hire a bunch of people to respond to this situation. So it involves shifting resources around, or simply people working harder to meet the demands of the situation. There's not a lot of slack, but there's some things obviously you can shift some resources to a certain extent. So those are the challenges when you have something that's completely new. We're used to rising volumes of unusual activity that we have to address. But when you have just something new come out all of a sudden, that's certainly a challenge.
I would also say the product scams as well. I think that there's a challenge around that, to be able to monitor for the medical supplies and the mask and those types of things. So you would have to rely upon your analytics to perhaps pull in those types that, either types of information to be able to see if there is any indication of that, and really kind of take that and focus in on that. I would think that would be a challenge. I do think it's, I hate to say it, an exciting time for us, because we are, kind of thinking outside of the box. We are being challenged too. And it's definitely been something where we've had to really, be proactive. Usually, I find that, in some certain circumstances, you're very reactive, and it's nice to be ahead of the curve per se, as much as we can be. But at least that's, some of my thoughts as far as that's concerned.
Les, I just wanted to quickly loop it back to securities ready. And what are some of the regulatory compliance challenges involved in the cloud-based recording of traders' conversations, when they're completing transactions? Because that's something that has to be done.
That might be a better question for Neil, I think. I'm not involved in the securities area, or Maura. If you're involved in that.
I
I'm
can
not
start
go
off.
ahead. Yep.
Okay. So I think trading at home, which is basically what professional traders are doing now from the wirehouses, has been a great success story too. So setting up virtual systems to run from home computers was done successfully early on, even as early as February, and it was running in March. And trading volumes are high because of the economic conditions, the headwinds, the volatility, the incredible volatility. And all of that worked, which is pretty amazing. In terms of surveying that activity, that also has worked. And there's just as with the successful AML surveillance that Maura was talking about, trade surveillance has also worked. It's basically just virtual systems. But I think there have been challenges in terms of the volumes we spoke about, but also insider trading scams centered around news cycles, again, sometimes having to do with vaccine development. There are many firms involved, but also there's a lot of small cap trading activity, and that's ripe for insider trading types of crime. So just the sheer volume of illicit trading, as it were, I think has been a challenge. And then there might be one other challenge, which is that communication surveillance, Eugene, as you mentioned, is a huge part of trade surveillance. If a broker is or a trader is in their office, they're confined to using certain communications tools, and those are being monitored through electronic AI-enabled communication surveillance in their email as well. If they're working at home, I think it brings up the possibility of using additional channels, like just their own phone, for example, and doing stuff outside of the network. And that could pose a challenge as well.
Okay. So what are the security challenges involved in enabling traders, as we've just been talking about, and related operations staff who have to work from home? So what are the challenges for the staff members that have to monitor and investigate trading transactions, the surveillance, and then even deeper once they find a problem? They can dig deep and investigate.
Well, I think it's cognate to the same operational challenges of having AML or fraud teams working from home, essentially. I think on that side, firms have been doing a pretty good job. It's more the challenges of the volatility and increased activity and the increased opportunities for illicit trading. Not sure if any of my colleagues on the panel have any further operational views.
Yeah, no, I would, as I mentioned, as far as, just, distractions, as far as, having the kids at home and the online learning and that type of thing, but also from a technology perspective, you're also at risk of more technology outages and also bringing down the system as far as, conducting the work. And I also think that, some of the investigators are used to having, a couple of different monitors to do the work, whereas now they're down to one, from working at home, and sometimes that may present a challenge. But they tend to get used to it after some time. But just I think in the beginning everybody went through a little bit of a hiccup, but the technology departments have been able to come through, and you just have to monitor the production from that perspective, and then kind of keep outreach going with the staff. I think that's also changed as well. I think some people tend to just sit at their desk and not really get up and walk around and talk to their counterparts. Whereas I think this has changed things around, whereas now you're Skyping, you're, communicating via email, you're constantly calling the staff to make sure, first of all, that everything's running smoothly and that they're okay as well. So I think that's been a couple of the enhancements that, institutions have had to place in. And even from a management perspective, you kind of have to manage up and manage down. Whereas, when you're in the office, it's a little bit, easier, or, maybe not happening as much as it should be.
Mm-hmm. So is it safe to say that some things are somewhat different, but that at least the surveillance aspect is the same, or maybe even more so? If there's more interaction among staff members?
There's definitely more interaction. We're also seeing a lot more feedback from the regulators, as I mentioned before, which has been fabulous. So please, if you're a regulator on the line right now, please continue to do that, because we do appreciate it. And we do, welcome it as well. And I think it's a two-way street. So, pick up the phone and call they want to hear from you as well, as far as what you're seeing, and if this is something that's going out. And also, your industry peers as well. I mean, as Les and Neil, as it's very helpful to call your counterparts and see what's going on. And I think it's definitely been a change as far as communication is concerned. I'm very communicative of a person, but I know that there are others that are not. And I think it's kind of put them in that position to be able to have to do that, as I mentioned, via the various modes of communication. And your team wants to hear from you. And I think, as I mentioned, you do get caught up in the day-to-day and running from one meeting to the next. And I think this has forced people to kind of sit down and actually speak to their teams on a more frequent basis to be able to, keep up the communication.
Okay, great. Maureen.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did you want to add something?
I was just going to say on the point that Maura made about communication with the regulators, I think that's really important. We've made it a point to keep our regulators up to date on the situation. They want to know how you're being affected. Is a lot of your staff out? Are you running into problems? And so it's very important to have that good communication. And as Maura said, we appreciate the communications we're getting from them, but it's important to keep those lines of communication open so that if you do run into an issue or problem, you make them aware of it right away and to let them know how you're doing.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more thing, like DFS, for instance, had put off the 504 and extended the time period to be able to respond to that by 45 days. I mean, those were definitely initiatives. And it was right, at the beginning of the pandemic when the due date was happening. And of course, institutions were working towards that date, but it was nice to see that they were saying, you know what, we'll give you guys a pass. You have an extra 45 days to be able to certify. And those are the things that I definitely welcome.
Just quickly remind me, what is a 504?
504 is the requirement for institutions to certify on both their sanctions and AML programs that everything is, in sync as far as your monitoring system. And you go through certain requirements of the 504 rule to say why my monitoring system is in check and why my sanctions is in check. And if there's any gaps that you want to identify, whether data and those types of things. Les, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, we're not subject to New York State, so.
Oh, okay.
No,
okay. No worries.
I think Maureen, you have a question from the audience.
Yes, can you talk a little bit about what are the technologies banks are using to detect AML and fraud? I know Neil's internet's going out in and out a little bit, but he's on audio still.
Firms use transaction monitoring systems, which have been rules-based traditionally, and most of them still are. To detect payments, they use monitoring systems, as well as they run screening of the initiators of the payments and the counterparties, watch list screening. For international payments, that's sanctions screening. That's a very heavily regulated area, which has resulted in very large fines for some banks not complying in the eyes of the regulators. I think what's different now and very interesting is that the last 4 or 5 years has seen the development of AI techniques. That's a shorthand term for not just artificial intelligence, but robotic process automation, natural language processing, and other techniques that can essentially automate, on the one hand, automate some of the processes, and on the other hand, take a different approach, perhaps a more advanced approach to identifying potentially suspicious activity, so better insights through analysis, AI analysis. And a number of those technologies emerged through basically RegTech startups, a lot of them cloud native, so it's very new technology. And typically low cost, smaller banks are using a lot of this technology. It's easier for them to take on new things, they're less regulated. But I think a very interesting aspect of what's happening now is that the challenges of the pandemic is leading some financial institutions to think about installing some of the more modern technology, so AI-driven technology, to augment their systems, basically. And so the challenges of COVID-19 may end up being an accelerator, in a sense, of the adoption of this more modern technology by larger financial institutions.
And then did you want to add something? I was just curious if you think the push for financial crime fighting technologies will spur banks and other firms to speed up their digital transformations as well.
Yeah, and I think, go ahead.
Please, I was going to say yes, but please, Maura. Yes.
No, I was going to say, well, I think they've already had to, especially on the KYC side of things. Firms have had to look to, digital type of mechanisms, and even, as far as, accepting soft copies of documentation in order to verify their identity. So they've definitely had to change their way of, technology in order to, open up a new account for a customer. And even just from a transaction monitoring perspective, I see real time monitoring happening. It is happening, but I think you're going to start seeing that change, going forward, as far as that's concerned, because I think it's definitely worthwhile to be on real time, whereas right now some firms are on post transaction monitoring, where you're monitoring after the fact, which isn't such a bad thing. But some of these types of scenarios that we've mentioned, may require the real time approach. And I'm not a technology guru, but I would assume it takes a lot to get that in place. But there are institutions that are doing that right now. So.
I was going to ask a quick question about cutting edge technology, but I think Neil actually answered that when he went into detail about artificial intelligence and some of the spin-offs thereof. But what are some of the trade-offs of loosening network security protections, of the strict passwords, maybe 2 or 3 steps for the password process? Some of that has had to be eased a little bit to make it easier for staff to log into their systems. But is there a trade-off to that?
Yeah, this is Neil again. I think there has been. I think that definitely cyber actors started zeroing in on the new vulnerabilities caused by work at home through virtual private networks. And early on, you may recall that some of those virtual private networks were compromised. Some providers' solutions were more vulnerable to attack. Banks and other financial institutions quickly found where the weaknesses were and moved to correct them. I believe in some cases even switching their providers, their solution providers there. So if with that strengthened network configuration, I think a lot of the risk has been reduced. Also, just for the general public, there's a Zoom incident where Zoom meetings, I think especially individual meetings, not business meetings, were being compromised, and Zoom immediately, not this one, rushed in to add those passwords, right, which we all love dealing with now. So quick responses such as that, I think, really did help with a lot of those threats. So I think that particular threat has been controlled pretty well, especially by large financial institutions.
And I also think that if we haven't already, you will see an increase in demand for staffing in cybersecurity. Computer intrusion was always a risk for the firms, and this has definitely created a heightened risk. So you will see that area, I think, as far as, the demand for, talent in that area will increase. And also, the SEC has tons of guidance out there on cyber. So if you need to, get a little bit more of a background on it, or just get some ideas as far as what you need to implement as far as cyber is concerned. For the smaller institutions, definitely go to the SEC website. There's a wealth of knowledge on there, and I think even FINRA even has information as well on that particular matter. And just one more thing, the OCC just put out a semi-annual risk perspective just for the spring, and some of the things that they've mentioned, and it's definitely worth a quick read. They talk about operational risk, increased fraud and cyber risk, and continue with your plans and your business continuity. So those are just things that they've mentioned as far as areas of risk that institutions should definitely be cognizant of.
Mm-hmm. Maura, you mentioned some of the upsides of this situation, that that there's greater transparency, better communication, more feedback. So do you think, is that going to be permanent? like a permanent positive thing to come from this?
I hope so. I hope so. I think it's a win-win in all aspects, and we've received feedback, from the staff saying that they, definitely value the transparency, and management does as well. And as we mentioned, the regulators are very interested as far as receiving that type of information, and I think it's beneficial. Honestly speaking, we were always reaching out to our peers to see what's going on, and it's really, really nice to hear from the regulators real time what's going on, as opposed to a couple of years ago where we may hear about some of the things in the SARS trends and analysis that they used to put out. FinCEN used to put out this great document as far as what they were seeing from a SARS perspective, but it was always so late in the game, and I do think we need to be much more proactive, as I mentioned, and almost it would be nice to be ahead of the perpetrators, I guess, per se, as opposed to always being behind the 8 ball, which is, sometimes how we feel. But I think this is also, giving the team a chance to think about things and feel part of, what's going on at the end of the day. I think, sometimes day in and day out, they're looking at these investigations and don't really feel like they're contributing to the final, product, and not opening up the newspaper and saying, oh, that investigation we just worked on contributed to, a big sting operation going on, in Brooklyn per se. So this is the way you make people feel valued. This is the way, the institutions will feel valued. And as I mentioned, I do welcome, these different types of guidance and different things that the regulators, our DFS as well, is putting out different things. So definitely welcome it. But I'll turn it over to, either Neil or Les to provide additional information if they want.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting inside the bank, the communication, because, large institution like Wells Fargo, you identify an issue, and then you have a call, and then it goes to a working group and a committee, and if it's significant enough, it's escalated to senior management. Well, in this situation, we have issues we're facing that have to be addressed today or tomorrow by everyone, right? So especially at the beginning, when all of a sudden you have people working remotely, when you have issues staffing some of your branches, you need people from the cyber people, the business people, the financial crimes people, the compliance people, the HR people. They all have to weigh in, and they all have to do it today, right? Because you're making these decisions today or tomorrow. So it's been interesting to see, we at Wells Fargo, they put together a very senior committee of people. I don't know if they're still meeting every day, but at the beginning they were, to discuss issues like this so that decisions could be made quickly. And that's something that's kind of unusual to see, see that kind of communication and collaboration work so quickly, and have these issues communicated across the bank. So that was interesting.
Unless there have been some other unexpected benefits. There's been the savings on real estate, savings on rent. Have there been some other cost cutting upsides?
Well, I think certainly, I can't speak for Wells Fargo and what our plans are, but in general, you can see for institutions that didn't have people working remotely, and I read about, especially some of the technology companies, there used to be, they wanted everybody to come in, and they talked about collaboration, and all of a sudden everybody's working from home, and everything seems to be working very well. So, people start to question, do we really need this much office space? Do we really need this much real estate? So I think that's an issue. Certainly working from home and working remotely was a trend that was developing, but now people have seen that it can work very well and seamlessly, and the security seems to be there, and the work the efficiency is maintaining. So I think these are, in this time where for some it's a challenging economy, I think you're certainly going to have people looking at those as possible ways to reduce costs.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think from a production standpoint, firms have been seeing a benefit. Either you're commuting into work, so that's, at least an hour, or doing various things before you, get to the office. Whereas now when you're working remotely, you get up, you make your coffee, and you're you're raring to go. So you might be logging in a lot earlier. We know for sure we're working a lot more hours in a good way. So they're seeing a lot more production from their workers in a good standpoint, whether it's longer hours or, just, and you can vary your hours as well now too. As I mentioned, with, people having children at home, maybe they've had to vary the hours, to that accordingly, but still be productive, regardless if they're working from 12 to 8 or 9 to 5, whatever the hours are. I think it's been a lot more flexible. And then also location wise, you don't necessarily have to have all of your staff in New York. You could have someone working from Charlotte, for instance, and still, have the same kind of production coming from them. So there isn't that also that need to have everybody, coming into the office. You could have these various other points of people working from, other areas, to be able to, still contribute, to your, anti-financial crimes program.
Mm-hmm. And also when you're hiring, you have more flexibility.
Sure.
If more people are working remotely and things are handled remotely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what are some of the downsides though from the lockdown and remote staff? I'm thinking of there might be some issues with correspondent banking that in the past have required in-person meetings and to finalize things and to move things forward. Those are certain efforts like that, just a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, correspondent banking, especially on the international side, is an area that can be challenging. As far as our regular community banking customers, a lot of it is going online and people are used to that. But, we have a correspondent banking network with over 1,000 foreign banks. And those are areas where, our business people and relationship business people around the world are used to keeping in close touch with the banks and, in certain areas, meeting with, they're required, under our policies to meet with them, for example, once a year in person, just to have a really good get together to discuss compliance issues and what's going on and make sure they're getting a good feel for the financial institution and maintaining the partnership. And of course, in this, time when nobody's traveling, you're unable to do that. So that's a challenge. Obviously you can have phone calls, but it's not the same as when you spend a day or half a day together with your partners and really sit down and talk to them and exchange information. So that's in one area where there's a challenge. It's just really the phone isn't a good substitute for those in-person meetings. And, correspondent banking is considered a high risk business area. So you really want to ensure that everything's working well. So that's one challenging area we've seen.
Mm-hmm. And then I guess, Maureen, we have another question from the audience.
Yes. Has there been a change in what is considered sensitive client information? Anybody?
I think as far as protecting it, I think, now it's, definitely more of a challenge, right? Because everything, as I mentioned, is soft copy and those types of things. So I think, and it's not that much of a challenge, but I think it's just a matter of, protecting that client information as far as confidentiality is concerned. At least that's my perspective, but everything else has been, from our standpoint, okay. But I'll turn it over to either Les or Neil if they have anything they want to add.
I have kind of a general comment. When you were talking, Maura, about the DFS 504 a little while back, that's very interesting because that is a major new requirement in New York, which affects many international banks that have outlets there too. But it's in play, and then the pandemic happens. Similarly, I think for client information, there's the California Personal Privacy Act. And so like the GDPR in Europe, this is pretty new for financial institutions, and they're having to deal with it. And then along comes the pandemic, and it makes it even more difficult to deal with. So I'm not sure that the pandemic has necessarily made client information more sensitive, but these large regulatory undertakings, which banks were dealing with, are still ongoing, and the banks are challenged to continue with their what they're planning under the current conditions. There might be one special case with client information, which is that unfortunately, the mortality of COVID puts certain accounts at risk. And there have been cases apparently where malefactors are trying to take over accounts. They're trying to find out which accounts are, I think, Maura, you referred to them, perhaps you were talking about this as well, dormant accounts. But there are new vulnerable segments of the population. So the elderly, more at risk for mortality, and their accounts more at risk for takeover. So I'm not sure if that's precisely a client information sensitivity issue, but it's definitely a client segment issue that is new in this current situation.
So Maureen, did we get another question?
Yeah, we do actually. It's a two-part question. So are you guys ready?
Yep.
Okay. Given that there are new types of fraud, are banks considering new ways to retool their models for monitoring transaction processing to uncover these new types? And how does a firm detect problems from such different modeling disciplines as those for CCAR and AML?
I'll take this, and then I think Les may have some, if not Neil. But I mean, the answer is yes. We've definitely had to definitely reimagine and be more innovative about these different types of things that are coming up. And as we mentioned, AI is definitely a particular component that would be utilized to be able to detect these type of real-time things. And also, between what you're seeing from the regulatory perspective, and then just within your own institution, you kind of get used to the idea of, going through different types of behaviors and saying, you know what, I want to see this. What are we doing with this? And then you get the information, and then, you kind of do your own assessment, or you have the team do an assessment around it. The challenge, though, with, tweaking the scenarios, as Les had mentioned before, it's, especially with the vendor type of thing, it tends to be sometimes a challenge from a timing perspective, because now you're relying upon the vendor and when they can conduct the changes and how. A lot of firms are turning towards in-house monitoring systems where you don't have this challenge, and instead of going through I'm just saying 6 to 9 month type of thing, you could change something, within, going to your UAT and your, below the line testing and those types of requirements. You could be looking at something as, seamless as 3 months if, you have a teams and a program around that. To the advantage of being able to do that. So there are, particular things around that where institutions are using that. But again, I think a lot of it is around the, artificial intelligence and, being able to pull in the data and also just polling the team as well, saying, what are you seeing? Are you seeing, and not to use the MTA, but if you see something, say something. I think that's definitely something we've been good about saying, if it doesn't seem right, then raise it. There is, in this day and age, don't assume anything, raise it, bring it to, your, management's attention, and let's take a look at it, because it could be anything. It could be an up and coming thing that we're not used to seeing, but those are the things that, institutions should be, kind of communicating or working towards, and or at least I'm sure they are, from the transaction monitoring perspective. Les, I don't know, if you have anything you want to add to that.
Sure. Interesting point you made, Maura. Our best source of information is usually from our team members, either from our tellers in the branches who are, always on the alert for unusual activity, or people in the lines of business who are always looking at the activity of their customers and looking for unusual activity. So those referrals are a great source of information. As for monitoring, we're always, we do, most of our work in-house, setting up our monitoring systems and our models. So on the one hand, we do have the ability to move more quickly than if we relied on a vendor. But on the other hand, as I said, due to the challenges of model validation, we can't always change them as quickly as we'd like. We're always testing old ones, evaluating old ones, testing new ones. But just an example, at the early days of the virus, I think people, when people are nervous, they want cash, right? They want to have cash on hand in case the financial system falls apart. So as the average cash withdrawal might have been $200. All of a sudden, people are withdrawing $1,000. That throws everything off.
Yes.
But you can't just change your parameters that quickly because you don't have the basis for doing so. So things like that make it difficult to change things very quickly. But we're always looking at and evaluating our monitoring systems.
Okay, as we move toward the end of the hour, I was just wondering, we haven't talked about workflows, but are the pandemic-inspired financial crimes causing firms to create new workflows within teams and across the organization? Will this lead to more innovation to help firms get ahead of the criminals? And then what will that lead to some, maybe long-term workflow changes?
Well, I'll kick it off. I mean, as far as workflow changes, that hasn't changed anything as far as, from what we're seeing from a workflow perspective. We've been maintaining, just business as usual. Other than, bringing in different aspects as far as utilizing other teams, yes, that has changed. And I think we'll see that going forward, especially to Les's point that you can't just change the scenarios on a whim, and nor do you want to, right? Hopefully this time period that we're looking at is just, hopefully an emerging trend, and hopefully we don't see this, keep going with, everything going back to normalcy, right? So there might be other changes going on. But as far as the workflow is concerned, there haven't been many changes, and resourcing as well. As I mentioned, you'll definitely see an increase in the cyber world. And I think as far as artificial intelligence, you'll definitely see an increase as far as the demand for resources around that. And also building an in-house system. I think you're going to see a technology increase or a want need. I mean, those are the rock stars as far as I'm concerned, and always have been. And I've, completely partnered with them in that aspect. And I also see that there'll be an increase and a want for those types of people, going forward.
Okay. Any final thoughts from Les or Neil?
Just on that point, for smaller banks, the overwhelming number of applications for the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, loan applications, has really overwhelmed banks in terms of opening new accounts from all these SMEs that are suddenly at their doors with these applications. And that has spurred some of these medium-sized banks in the U.S. to adopt automated technology on the KYC side. And the increase in digital financial services, as well as e-commerce, I think is also spurring additional need for automated account onboarding and KYC and screening. And so those twin drivers of the increased fraud and AML attempts, as well as the increased digital activity that is being accelerated by the pandemic, are driving automation technology forward, perhaps more at fintechs and smaller firms.
Les?
I would just make one point. We didn't have a chance to discuss business continuity planning, but obviously this is a time when most of the time it seems like a waste of time planning for this, planning for that. And I don't know how many people actually plan for a pandemic, but when you have the business continuity plan in place, either for some kind of emergency, and you think about what you could do, obviously, you realize how important it is now, as all of a sudden we have this pandemic and lots of things have changed. So I think everybody will appreciate more, if they didn't already, business continuity planning and what to do when exigent circumstances arise.
Mm-hmm. All right, Maureen, are we done? I guess.
Yes, I think that's it. We're at the top of the hour. Thank you so much, Les, Maura, and Neil, for participating.
Yes, thank you.
Again today. Thank you so much. I really
everybody.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
And thank you all of our watchers today. We hope you join us next week, July 22nd, for our regular Wednesday session, which will be a follow-up to today's discussion, where we're going to be talking about cybersecurity lessons learned from the lockdown. And we do have somebody from FINRA who is joining us. So if you haven't registered for that episode, please do. We will continue to have smooth sailing with our technology. So thanks again, everyone. We hope to see you again soon.